Hi, I'm Vicki Herriot. I'm Dean of Faculty at MIU. I was born in New York City, but I was raised in Billings, Montana, so I'm a combination of city and country. My heritage is European, so I guess I identify as, I don't really think of myself in these terms, but if I have to fill out a form, I say white Caucasian female. I actually don't like doing that. I would rather put NA because I don't think it serves a purpose. There's very rarely a time when that's an important thing to know. So I don't really like having to do that. Well, I just don't think I think of myself in those terms, in terms of my identity. My identity is more involved with who I am inside and the roles I play in life, rather than that particular categorization. My parents moved from New York City to Billings, Montana when I was 3. So I really grew up in the rural world of Montana. The town I lived in was one of the biggest cities in Montana. I think it is the biggest city right now, which is maybe 150,000. So it's probably like the suburb of a big city, but without the big city. So it's that kind of an environment. But my grandfather moved from the Midwest to Montana in the 20s, before the Depression, and sold Hudson vehicles, Hudson cars, which none of you know what they are because they're no longer. But he sold cars, and during the Depression, people wanted to go home in style, so they would trade land for cars. So he ended up building up a ranch empire from his car dealership. So we had land in the country that we would go to on the weekends. So I was somebody who, even though I was raised in more of a suburban kind of environment, I was out in the country on the weekends, and I actually had a horse in my backyard because we built our house on the edge of the town. So I would ride my horse around the neighborhood and sing songs to it. I had a pretty idyllic childhood, I have to say. We also had a cabin in the mountains, again, that my grandfather had traded for a car. And that cabin is now very close to a big ski resort called Big Sky. So I didn't like that idea that Big Sky was going to be built, because even though I'd gone skiing and we had a ski resort close to our hometown, Billings, I really liked the pristine wilderness where the cabin was, and I didn't like to think of it being disturbed. But it wasn't up to me. And now it's a big, burgeoning ski resort, and I appreciate that I can bring my son and my nieces and nephews, and we can all go skiing up there, and it's a beautiful place. So even though I didn't really want it to come, I appreciate that it's there, and it's been a place that my family can gather, and so that's been a good thing. Yes, the cabin's still there, but my brothers all married women who really didn't appreciate spending time in a cabin without an indoor toilet. So they convinced my brothers to buy condos in the ski resort. So we have the cabin, which I always go to with my son and my husband, and everybody else goes to the condos, which is great because we can go up there too and use the shower facilities and all that stuff. So I still like the rustic part, but we now have more modern conveniences, which my mother is very happy about that. She used to have to wash our sheets in big tubs of water that she had to heat on the wood-burning stove. And so it was pretty rustic when we would spend maybe a month or so in the summer up there. And we had a great time, but I think in retrospect, it was probably pretty challenging for my mom. But, gave us a taste of what pioneer life was like in that part of the country. I have 4 younger brothers. I was the oldest. We're a very diverse group. We're very close. My mother and her siblings were quite close. So growing up, we had a very close bond with our cousins. And we felt that it was important to do the same thing for our own children. So when I talk about going skiing at Big Sky, we would all the family would come, all the siblings and their kids, and my parents and assorted other friends and neighbors would come and for skiing trips and for summer vacations. My mother we always had a few extra, even though we had 5 kids. She would usually throw in a few friends who wanted to come with us up at the cabin or out at the ranch. So that was a model I followed in my own life, even though I only had 1 child and she'd had 5. I wanted my son to have that experience of growing up with a lot of people. I think that you're less selfish when you have to share. And if you're an only child, sometimes you don't really understand that concept because you don't have anyone you have to share with. But if you're in an environment with cousins, older and younger, and he had a lot of friends who were single children, so we kind of brought them together as a group. So I think he feels now that he's very close to the kids that were in his class and to his cousins, that they have more of a sibling relationship than maybe in other situations. I also had the unique experience of when I was a senior in high school, I was chosen to be part of the American Field Service program, which was started by ambulance drivers during, I think, World War I, and then again they served in World War II. And they felt that if people could get to know each other on a personal level, there would be no more war. They were very traumatized by having to be involved. The ambulance drivers obviously saw some of the worst effects of war and wanted to do something to change that. So they created this organization called the American Field Service based on that ambulance service, and organized for students to go and live with families for a year. And originally when I went, it was Americans would go to countries all over the world, and people from all over the world would come to live with families in America. A few years after I was part of the program, they expanded it. So now somebody from Sweden can go to Australia, as somebody from Kenya can go to Japan. So it's not so much everybody coming to the US and the US going to other countries, but very much a worldwide mishmash. And it's a really good program because they really try to match you with the family that they put you with, so that you feel, I call the family that I lived with, I call them Mom and Papa. My Swedish siblings were like my siblings. I went to Sweden. I don't know if I said that part. I was chosen to go to Sweden, and not because I knew anything about Sweden or Swedish. I'd never heard it before I got on the boat, and we had some Swedish classes. We took a boat from New York to Rotterdam, and over that week we learned some Swedish, and then we went to a little village in the north of Sweden for a 2-week language camp, after which I could say things like, I'm a girl and I'm hungry. These were things I never had to say. No one ever needed to know that I was a girl or that I was hungry. They always offered me food. What I should have been told was how to say I'm full, because no one ever did teach me that. And the first time I was trying to say it, because they'd given me enough food, I said, sometimes you can use English words and people will kind of get it. So I said, jag är full, which I didn't know actually means I'm drunk. Wasn't so useful because they hadn't actually given me anything to drink. So anyway, it sometimes can be a danger to use those kinds of things. But I went to school in a Swedish school, and my Swedish mama didn't speak English, so I had to really learn Swedish. My papa was quite fluent in English, but he would only speak to me if there was like an emergency that I really needed to know what was going on, and he would tell me. Otherwise, they just, let me figure it out. And it was a great way to learn the language. After a few months, I think I was pretty fluent. I don't remember, the very first time I had to take a test, I had to take it in Swedish. And so it was probably not very good, but it was as good as I could do. And you just, when you're thrown in the deep end like that, you just kind of learn it. Most of my Swedish friends could speak English because they all learned English in school. My English teacher wouldn't let me speak in class because she didn't want me to ruin everybody's accent with my American accent. She was trying to teach British English, and she didn't want me ruining them. So I only got to speak at the very end of the school year. She wanted me to give a little survey of American literature, in like an hour. So I was, probably a bit of an overachiever. So I tried to cover the entire American literature in an hour really fast. And I'm sure they didn't understand a word I said, but they were really impressed because they'd never heard me speak so fast. And, in English, I was a little slower in Swedish. But anyway, that was a fabulous experience that has influenced my life because I now have a much better understanding of how students feel when they come to MIU. They're far away from their family. The kinds of things that are challenging aren't necessarily the big things you think about, they're the little things. Every once in a while, I'll scare some poor Swedish student by speaking to him in Swedish when he doesn't expect it, because no one outside of Sweden really, they don't expect anyone to speak Swedish outside of Sweden. But it's really, I've continued to have a relationship with the family there. I went back to visit them when I married Scott about 12 years ago and introduced him to my family. And they came to my first wedding, and they've come to visit me over the years. So and all my brothers have gone to visit them. So it did what they wanted. They created a family between people from different countries. And so I think it was a big success. I've had 2 different young men live with me during their high school time. I had a boy from North Carolina who wanted to go to the Marshy School, so he lived with us for 3 years. And then I had a German boy who also wanted to go to the Marshy School, so he lived with us for 3 years. So I did a little bit of payback in that regard of bringing somebody into my own family that way. And it's a great experience. Okay, I studied psychology in college. I went to Wellesley College, which is a girls' school, a women's college outside of Boston, which was a really great experience. We had small classes. I never had the experience of teachers giving attention to men in class instead of me, because there weren't any men. So it was a big shock. I remember one of my classmates saying, she was a year ahead, and she said, "Okay, watch out. What's really going to shock you is when you go to graduate school and they ignore you and only call on the men." And I was like, what? Why would they do that? Sure enough, I went to law school after I graduated, and the first place I went to law school was the University of Montana, and there were 70 students in our first year class, and 7 of us were women. So that was, first of all, a big shock, having come from an all-women's college, and also just sort of the childish behavior of the men, but I won't hold that against them. I'm sure they all grew up eventually. Okay, I went to 4 different law schools, which is well above average. The first one was the University of Montana, 70 students, 7 of them were women. The second law school was the University of Santa Clara in Santa Clara, California, because my boyfriend from college had gone to UC Santa Cruz, and we decided we didn't want to be quite so far apart, me in Montana and he was in California. So I went to University of Santa Clara, which was a Jesuit school. A school I really liked it. It was a really nice school. It was very nice to be going to school somewhere where it's warm all year long. You can eat grapefruits off the tree while you're studying. I would say it was probably my favorite of all the law schools I went to. I don't remember what the ratio of men to women was. It was definitely more men, but it wasn't as dramatic as the University of Montana. Then we got married, and Skip transferred back to Harvard to get his PhD. So now I had to transfer law schools for the second time, and I transferred to Boston University. And that was great, but there's a rule in the ABA that you have to go to one law school for 2 years. So rather than 3 years of law school, I went to 4 years. And then, perhaps being a glutton for punishment, I don't know. My 4th year, I took a lot of classes in tax, which is what my dad was. My dad was a tax lawyer. And I was born when he was studying at MIU in New York. And he stayed there for a few years, and that's why I lived there those first years of my life. And I had a very interesting experience. My last year of law school, we were down in New York visiting family for Thanksgiving, and I walked by this building in Greenwich Village, which is where NYU is, and I didn't know what it was, but I had this incredibly powerful feeling, like deja vu, only in reverse, that I was going to be at this place in sometime in the future. And I didn't know what it was. It was just one of these experiences. And then I found out that it was the law school later. And in fact, I don't even know that I knew it at the time, but I had taken all these tax courses in that extra year I had of law school, and decided that the thing about tax that I liked was that it was like a puzzle. And law doesn't really change that much. You don't really want it to change that much. You want there to be some stability and something that people can depend on. But the tax law does change. And I had a feeling that I might get bored with other kinds of law, that there wasn't much change really. Whereas with tax law, there was always going to be something new and different. So anyway, I decided to get my master's in law and literature in taxation at NYU. So after graduating from BU, I went down to NYU and commuted back and forth on the weekends to be with my husband, who stayed in Boston to finish up his degree. And then I got a job in a Boston law firm and worked there for a couple of years in the tax department. And then my husband was doing research. For his dissertation, he did a study on the effects of TM in maximum security prisoners in Walpole State Prison in Massachusetts. And when he finished his dissertation, he was kind of, the expectation was we would probably come to MIU. We knew all about MIU. We'd become TM teachers, and we were really going to school to come here, in preparation to come here. For us, we used to joke that Boston was like the minor leagues, and we were going to go to the majors when we went to MIU, because MIU was new, it was experimental, it was doing something that we wanted to do to create an educational institution that was not like the ones we had gone to, but was something different. So that was really my motivation in going to law school, and Skip's in getting his PhD in psychology. We were asked by Marcy to come to Switzerland, so I quit my job and we went to Switzerland and worked on a book called The Cosmic Psyche. So we would sit with him and talk about psychology and theories of psychology and how they related to consciousness and higher states of consciousness. And it was a really exciting and wonderful wonderful experience. At the end of that, Marcy suggested to Skip that he might want to do research on the square root of 1% effect, the Marcy effect, and maybe do it in one country in every continent of the world, just kind of a small assignment. So he took it very seriously, and we went back to the United States and tried to figure out how to do square root of 1% research in one country in every continent. So we started, we'll find one country, we'll start with that. And we went to a lot of embassies, talking to them about what we were doing. We talked to a lot of corporations, because we thought, how are we going to get the square root of 1% number? We have to get people to be siddhas so that we can do this experiment. And so we thought that we might be able to get a corporation who would pay for its people to start meditating and to get the siddhis. And we didn't get too far with that, other than the people said, oh, I don't know about this TM Siddhi thing, but we know TM is good for people, so yeah, we'll start a TM program. Anyway, eventually we figured out that there was a country in the world that had a large population of siddhas already, and also had a war going on in its near vicinity, and that was Israel. Israel had 30,000 meditators, and we needed 197 to be the square root of 1% of the population of Israel, and there were more than that in the country. But we had to get them all together in the same place. So we were aiming for 200 as our target number to be the square root of 1%. And we hoped that it would not only impact Israel itself, but the war in Lebanon, which was right next door. And that's what we found. So some of you probably already heard me talk about this study in the past, or maybe you've read about it, but it was an incredibly powerful experience. It was wonderful to be a part of this community. We were the first Jews to ever be in this particular hotel, which was owned by Christian Arabs. They had never had any Jewish person in their hotel. They were very excited by us and meeting everybody there. They started TM. They started Hebrew lessons with the national leader of Israel, who was with us on this course. We taught a lot of their friends TM. We got to interact with the Armenian community in Jerusalem, other Arabs, Christian Arabs mostly. And it was a really wonderful, wonderful experience, very powerful time. And what we thought would happen, happened. So anyway, it was a very powerful experience to be there. What we wanted was to have an impact that would encourage the government to support what would be known later as a group for government, so that they would sponsor a group of siddhas and permanently create peace in the Middle East, which, as everyone knows, is a challenge that still hasn't been met. And so we talked with everybody we could talk to. We talked with scientists at different universities. We talked to government ministers. We talked to Air Force generals. I'm not sure if that's what Air Force generals are called, but anyway, we talked to top people in the Air Force. And interestingly, there's a tradition there's something in the Jewish tradition that says that the world is held together by a small number of enlightened people, that at any time there are a small number of enlightened people in the world who may not know who each other are. That's not necessary, but that's what kind of keeps the world together. So this was not a strange idea to them, that a small group of people could create peace. They were very open to the idea. The challenge was, in Israel, like in many other countries, the more conservative religious groups in the country felt that TM was a threat to their religion and was somehow taking people away from their religion. And so they didn't want to support any kind of group that would involve TM. Well, the thing about Israel is it's got so many diverse political parties that the smallest group is the very core, hardcore religious fundamentalist Jewish group. But they are the group that everybody has to join with in coalition, or they don't have a coalition. So even though they're the smallest group, they have a great deal of control, a great deal of power, because every other group has to join with them in some way in order to make a government. So it's an interesting scenario. I was born, I guess I was born a Presbyterian. And when I was in my middle school years, my dad, who'd been raised Episcopalian, wanted us all to go to the same church, and he didn't want to go to the Presbyterian church. So we went to the Episcopal Church. My mom converted to being Episcopalian, and I liked the Episcopal Church a lot, actually. I have very fond memories of that. But my husband, Skip, was Jewish, and I felt very strongly that it was important for my son to be raised with both of us on the same page, and that it was important for him to have a religious upbringing, that it was important to understand a religious tradition and be a part of that. And so before he had his bar mitzvah, I converted to Judaism. And so we both converted at the same time, because in order to be Jewish, the Jewish rules are that the mother has to be Jewish. So that was one reason that that I converted. The reason for that is that they wanted to be sure that children who were the product of rape would be brought up in the Jewish tradition. So when that kind of violence was directed at the community, that's when they decided that that was the rule that would determine who was Jewish, rather than who the father was, what the father's religion was. I actually had always felt I was Jewish. I had always felt I was Jewish. In a weird way, because I didn't know anything about Judaism. When I was little, I remember I had a friend who was Jewish, and she said, I don't even know, I never heard this except from her, so I'm not really totally sure this is true. But she said she had to be really nice to her brother, because until he was a certain age, he could be the Messiah. And I thought, oh boy, if I had to do that, forget it. I had 4 younger brothers, and if I had to treat them like they were maybe the Messiah, that would not have worked well in our family. So at the time, I thought, well, I'm glad I'm not Jewish. But later, when I was in college, one of my best friends was Jewish, and I started going to her house for holidays, and I felt very comfortable there. And I still have very positive feelings about Jesus, but I feel that even when I was a little girl, I just couldn't understand why God would make a world that only people who believed in Jesus, and there were many who didn't even know anything about him, would get to go to heaven. It just didn't make sense to me. And so the Jewish tradition is certainly foundational to Christianity. And when we were in Israel, I felt very, very comfortable there, and very much, people actually thought I was the one who was Jewish, not Skip, which I don't know why they didn't think he was Jewish, but it seemed to be something that fit me from a spiritual perspective and from a personal perspective. His parents never made put any pressure on me to convert from their perspective. And my parents were very good about letting me do what I felt comfortable doing for my own spiritual, going my own spiritual path. And they were there when my son got bar mitzvahed, and were very supportive of him. Yeah, I was a very, I don't know whether I would say enthusiastic, committed. I was, active in my church when I was in high school. I was a member of a group called, I forget what it was, some kind of youth group for Jesus. I felt very comfortable with Jesus and what he stood for and what he was in my life. But I didn't think that meant I had to be a Christian and not be a Jew. So Jesus was a Jew. So I didn't feel there when I became Jewish that necessitated my rejecting Jesus for who he was and his role in my life. But I did feel more connected to the Jewish tradition and the Jewish faith in terms of how I wanted my son to be raised. Which is, it's interesting for us, because one of my brothers married a girl who was Jewish, and so his daughter's Jewish. But he also has another daughter whose mother is an evangelical Christian. And my other brothers are more or less involved in Christianity. I wouldn't say anybody was as involved in Christianity really as I was when I was younger, or as I am as a Jew. So it's kind of an interesting thing. I converted to Judaism after my first husband died, so he wasn't even alive when I decided to convert. So for him, you know, I think he would have been happy that I did it. It wouldn't have mattered one way or the other, but he would have understood and would have been appreciative. And when I married Scott, I wanted to be sure that whoever I married, if I married again, understood that this was a commitment that I'd made. I wasn't just doing it for my son, I was doing it for myself. And that I am a part of the local synagogue and feel that connection. And Scott's been really good about that. He comes to services and stuff. He doesn't have any particular desire to convert, but he's very appreciative of my participation, and he likes to come to services. And he doesn't really go to a church on his own. So for him, it wasn't, these are the religious services he goes to. Well, Skip and I met when we were freshmen in college. Harvard and Radcliffe and Wellesley used to have a big picnic, and everybody would come together, and it was called a mixer. And so people got a chance to meet each other, and we met at that mixer. We started going out. We started transcendental meditation together. We went to teacher training together. So we were a pretty committed couple. By the time we finished teacher training, he was then going to graduate school in California, and I was going to go to graduate school wherever. I wasn't really sure. He felt very uncomfortable. He wasn't ready to commit yet, and so he really actually didn't want me to be in California. And I wasn't particularly sure I wanted to go to law school, so I thought, okay, I'll go to law school in Montana. It's going to be the least expensive. It'll make my dad happy, and we'll just see how it goes. And so I did, and I taught TM that year, probably more people in that year than I ever taught, because I actually, one of the first people I taught was a guy named Ulysses Doss, who was the head of the Black Studies program. The University of Montana had the second Black Studies program outside of California in the country. Why is, who knows? Because there were 4 Black students who went to the president of the university and said, we think you should have a Black faculty member, and we think we should have African American studies here. And he said, okay, well, let's see what we can do. And Doss, everyone called him Doss, was a minister from Chicago who'd actually worked with Martin Luther King and other members of the civil rights movement. And he just happened to be in town. I never did find out what he was doing there. But anyway, they offered him a job, and he said, sure. Well, I don't think he said sure right away. I think he had to think about it. But he decided, okay, this is a challenge. I think I'm ready to take this on. And he just put director of the African American Black Studies on his door, and that was the beginning of the African American Studies program. And when he started meditating, he loved it. And so he would tell his students that they should start this thing called TM. And so he was kind of like, his classes were a feeder to my introductory lectures. And his classes were incredibly popular. He also recruited more African American students. Montana is a very non-diverse state. Growing up, I had no students of any other race in my school. I think we had 1,600 kids in our school. There was one African American girl in high school when I was at the other school, the other high school in town. The minority population, which is not a great way to describe it, but the Native population in Montana, of course, were the Native Americans. And they just, because of the way the schools were divided, I didn't have any students like that in my school. which wasn't a great thing, but it was what it was. And so I really didn't have any exposure to diversity in my adolescence and youth. I did definitely have exposure to Native Americans because my grandfather was quite close to the Crow tribe, and he was in charge of, at our local fair, the different tribes, the Crow and the Cheyenne, would come and perform dances as part of the fair festivities. And my grandfather was in charge of them and organizing them and paying them. So I would always be part of that with him, and I loved it. People, when I was little, thought I was Indian because I had long dark hair, and they, gave me an Indian name, and I fantasized about being an Indian princess. So probably at that age I identified with being Indian, but they probably generously allowed me to be in that fantasy and gave me a name, Running Horse. But that was another world, and it wasn't as integrated into my high school, so it wasn't really part of that world. So meeting Das when I was in law school and being exposed through him to the African American world, to some extent, his classes were incredibly popular. He had standing room only for his class on Gandhi and King. And he had, I think I just was reading about this because I was looking him up the other day. He's 87 now, and I want to reach out to him and just let him know what I'm doing. I haven't been in touch for a long time, and just to let him know. He also, when my husband and I got married, we had one ceremony in my grandmother's house with my uncle, who was a Unitarian minister and a Jewish rabbi. And then we had another ceremony with Das in the mountains outside of his house on a mountaintop with some other friends who weren't able to come to the first wedding, in a beautiful ceremony that he had written. And he bemoaned the fact that a lot of the people that he had married didn't stay married, which was depressing to him. So I always wanted to let him know, not only we did stay married, we were together for 30 years before Skip died. And I always wanted to let Das know. Well, I never actually had a Jewish wedding because the rabbi wouldn't marry us in a Jewish ceremony because I hadn't converted then, I wasn't Jewish. So he just gave a blessing. And it's a very similar ceremony. I mean, I've been to Jewish weddings, and we did something kind of similar when Scott and I got married. But one of the things with a Jewish wedding is you have a chuppah, which is, in our case, we used a prayer shawl. Men have prayer shawls in the Jewish tradition. So that's attached to 4 different poles, and people hold on to those poles. So when Scott and I got married, we got married in Dalby. I think we're the only people who've ever been married in Dalby, but it was great. And Evan Finkelstein was our officiant, and my 4 brothers held the poles of the chuppah, and we used Skip's prayer shawl as the covering. And we kind of wrote our own vows. But one of the things that is symbolic in Jewish weddings, and you always see if you're watching, Jewish weddings on TV, or movies, they always show you, they wrap a wine glass in a handkerchief and then you step on it. And that's to sort of symbolize the good and the bad that comes with a marriage, and also to kind of, bring good luck, I think, to the marriage is one of the reasons for doing it. But it's the similar kinds of vows that you take in any other, in a Christian wedding. How do I know that I'm a woman? Well, I never really had any negative feelings about being a woman, because My mom was a very strong person. My grandmother, my mother's sisters. My father was very supportive of me as a woman, that I could do whatever I wanted. It never occurred to me that I couldn't do anything I wanted. My aunt was one of the first women, when she served in the Montana State Legislature and was the only woman senator in that body. I think she was she was a representative before she became a senator, and was a very strong role model for me. Her younger sister, my mom's younger sister, was Miss Montana and rode her horse in the Miss America pageant in Atlantic City, which was the last time they've allowed anybody to ride a horse in the pageant. The horse was very well behaved, no pooping was involved, but they were afraid that was going to happen. But, you know, she was an equestrian and that was her talent, and so she I don't even really know why, I never asked her why she tried out to be Miss Montana, probably for the scholarship or something. She wasn't that kind of person. As it turns out, she was gay, but that was something that she did not share with us growing up. No, her brother's wife, who did have 5 children, also came out as gay after her children were pretty much grown up. But my aunt, who lived in Montana, always had girlfriends, and we didn't think anything about it one way or the other. It was just Aunt Jeannie and Aunt Carol, and no one ever said anything about their relationship. As far as we were concerned, they were a couple, I think. We probably would have thought that if we had thought about it. Not probably in the same way we would have thought about our parents being a couple. But certainly they were committed to each other and they lived with each other for probably 20, 30 years. I don't know now how long it was, but right before my aunt died, she told my cousin who was with her, she said, "Now you know, Jeannie was more than my friend." And my cousin said, "Aunt Carol, we all knew that. You know, you weren't fooling anybody." But she didn't feel that was something she could express or be, open about, even though I think probably everybody did know it, and no one talked about it. But it was, it just was, it was what it was. But yeah, so I think I had models of all kinds of womanhood in my family and all ways of expressing that. My mother having 5 kids, my aunt not having any, one aunt being a politician, and everybody basically feeling that the aspect of yourself that was feminine could be expressed in whatever way you wanted it to be. So I think I had really good role models in that way. I don't think, there definitely is an expectation. There was an expectation when I was younger that if you wanted to be successful as a woman, you had to be better than the men. That was just sort of it. Even if you were, that didn't necessarily mean that you would get the same jobs that they got. I didn't really experience that when I was applying for jobs. There was only one woman in my law firm of 128 lawyers who was a partner. But I was kind of used to that at that point. We saw ourselves as breaking down these kinds of barriers, and there were probably equal number of young women coming into the law firm as men at the time. So we felt that was going to change. We didn't, there probably were a few more men than women, but we saw that, if we stayed and we wanted to be partners, that was not going to be close to us. We didn't feel that would be close to us. My funniest experience, though, in the law firm was some partner came up to me and handed me a bunch of papers, and he said, "Can you type this for me?" And assuming that I was a secretary, because he just wasn't used to young women lawyers. And I was not a particularly good typist. And so I said, I don't think you really want me to do that. And then I explained, and of course he was very embarrassed that he had not recognized that I was a young lawyer, but how would he necessarily? The only people that were women in the law firm that were young were secretaries, so it wasn't surprising. But that's changed. That's definitely changed in the field of law, and I think it's a good thing. But women bring something different to a situation, and so I appreciate that. At MIU we have a lot of women faculty and leaders within the administration, and we support each other, and I think we bring something different, extra to the table. So I think it's a good thing. I don't know if I ever had that experience. Just because I was fortunate enough to be given the opportunities that I wanted. I never felt like I didn't get something because I was a woman. But I was lucky. There were definitely people who were as qualified who didn't make that 7, who were in my first law school class. It wasn't that there were only 7 people who were women who were competent to be in law school, but I was one of those, so I didn't have to feel, I didn't get in because of that. I don't think I've ever wanted to do something that I haven't been allowed to do because I was a woman. I guess I'm lucky. Well, I think white privilege is a reality that every white person has to accept and acknowledge. It's something I certainly didn't ever think about it growing up. I didn't know there was anything other than my life. I didn't know how anyone else lived. You don't when you're a child. You see your friends, and that. I remember when I went to Boston for the first time, and I saw, huge numbers of Black people, which I'd never seen before. And I thought, how could people be biased when there are so many people? I always thought, well, maybe if there's only 1 or 2 and you don't know very many people, then maybe you can create this kind of bias. I'd heard things that were racist, probably, not from my parents. It wasn't something that would have come up because there just wasn't any other race. And, it's weird to say, but it was the reality. It's not quite that extreme now, but it certainly was then. But now, looking back in my life, I had good friends like Doss, when I was in law school, but also when I was a student, I had good friends who were Black when I was, students with me. And I didn't get it. I had no idea where they came from and how hard it may have been for them to come to be where they were and the kind of things that they may have been subjected to. Nobody really shared that with me in a way that I understand now, or beginning to understand now. But it's just, it's now I realize it's just something that you go through with taking for granted certain things that are, like you were asking me, was the worst thing about being a woman. I was fortunate that I grew up in a family where men respected the women in the family. I never had any sense that women should not be respected or that there was any reason that we couldn't do whatever we wanted. If I was a Black woman, I might have a totally different story. Even if my parents had had the same attitude, because I wouldn't have had that protective layer of white privilege. I would tell them to embrace their whole selves and not be afraid of doing anything that they want to do. There should be no barriers. But there also shouldn't be expectations that you can't be something, that some part of womanhood is cut off that we shouldn't appreciate. You know, I'm not a particularly I don't know how to say, feminine. You know, I don't wear a lot of makeup, or nobody in my family did that. The women in my family didn't particularly wear makeup, but I don't think there's anything wrong with that. You know, for some people, they love that. That's part of, for them, being a woman. So I would say, be who you are. You know, if it's, you want to do that, or you want to wear whatever you want to wear, you know, that there shouldn't be any sort of boundaries on what people think they can be and what they can do. And I think it's that world is there for women now. I don't think anyone needs to feel that they can't go forward. And there's so many great examples of women who just, I think now we've got so many wonderful models for young girls growing up to see what possibilities there are. As I said, I was fortunate within my own family. Not everybody had those kind of models in their family, but now those models are out there, you know, and all colors, races, religions. It's much more of a rainbow reality than it was when I was growing up. And I think that that is a gift to this generation from the previous generations. When you look back and see what people had to do, both from a cultural perspective, and you know, we're talking about women from the perspective of being a woman. A lot of those battles have been fought, so take advantage of it and don't let anything hold you back.